Welcome to the latest session in the Learning, Equity, and Power, or LEAP series, presented by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. My name is Anand Sharma, and I'm a Senior Associate at CSSP, and I'll be your host for this session. Before we jump into conversation with our guests, I wanted to share a bit about CSSP and the LEAP initiative. CSSP works to achieve a racially, economically, and socially just society in which all children and families thrive. To do this, we promote public policies grounded in equity, support strong and inclusive communities, and advocate with and for all children and families marginalized by public policies and institutional practices. We seek to transform ideas into action, and LEAP is a new initiative to help us do just that. During this session and throughout the series, we will be highlighting and encouraging learning about what it takes to advance equity and build power in communities. We hope that you'll join us, contribute your expertise and experience, and think about how these lessons might help you to more powerfully advance equity in the communities that you care about. Given CSSP's longstanding commitment to supporting community policy and systems change, we couldn't be more thrilled to continue our LEAP series with this session, A Foundation's Path to Power Building and Health Equity, Lessons from the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities Initiative. CSSP has had the pleasure and the privilege of being one of TCE's learning partners over the past few years, and we're excited to share some of the insights we and other learning and evaluation partners have discovered alongside TCE and its many, many partners across California. In this session, we'll hear about TCE's path to supporting community power building, how we can use an ecosystem approach to better understand and support power building, and some of the implications for philanthropic strategy and practice that is aimed at advancing racial and health equity. We are very fortunate to be joined by three amazing guests who can help offer just a introduction, the slightest introduction to the large collection of research and learning, drawing on TCE's past decade of work through building healthy communities. I'll be introducing them one at a time, and then we'll have a bit of conversation with all three. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Lauren Padilla-Valverde, who serves as TCE's Director, Racial Equity Practice and Culture. Lauren, welcome to the LEAP Lab. How are you this morning?
Good morning from the West Coast. Buenos dias. How's everybody? It's nice to see all the beautiful faces. Good morning.
We are so happy to have you, Lauren. I'm going to get right into it because there's so much that we want to talk with you about. But before we talk about BHC, before we talk about TCE, I just wanted to start with a more personal question. And I'd love for you to share with folks the path that you took, your kind of unique entry into the world of philanthropy.
Thanks, Anand, and thank you again, and good morning. Yes, my name is Lauren Padilla-Valverde. I am the daughter of Guatemalan immigrants who came to the United States in the late 60s, fleeing violence and a lot of political upheaval that was actually as a direct response to the US forces there in that country. And when you ask me how I came into philanthropy, I always go back to sort of the origins of my lineage, which includes my dad and his influence. He was an organizer in Guatemala. And the through line of my upbringing, my educational experience, and ultimately my medical career before philanthropy was really in understanding, that change doesn't happen only at the top. Change has to happen at the roots. And my work in medicine was mostly focused on, in medicine, we focus on the symptoms to address, but in Western medicine, we don't tend to focus on root causes. And about 12 years ago, I had an opportunity to come into philanthropy. And what piqued my interest about the opportunity was that the opportunity was in the community I grew up in the Salinas Valley, which is the central coast of California, which is where my parents came to work in the first vineyards. And there was something about that opportunity that, really brought me to the California Endowment. I never thought I would be in philanthropy. I thought I was going to stay in medicine. And here I am 12 years later.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, we're so glad you made the journey and the transition to philanthropy. So I think you already spoke to a couple of the themes and that will come out of this conversation. And I think that it's one reason I wanted you to share a little bit about your path into philanthropy. So for folks that may not know, they may have heard of the California Endowment. They may know that it's a health conversion or a health legacy foundation, but could you share a little bit about BHC? What are some of the big goals? What did it set out to do? And what are some of the kind of key components of the Building Healthy Communities initiative?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anand. So the genesis of Building Healthy Communities, what we call, this 10-year place-based community change initiative taking place in 14 communities all across California, from as far north as, the Oregon border to as far south as San Diego, and all in between, the Central Valley. And the idea behind it was, what if instead of focusing our investments primarily on services, on addressing the symptoms, what if we instead focused on investing on the root causes of health and life inequities? And by doing so, really engaging and creating pathways of opportunities for those who were directly impacted by those health and life inequities, who we believed at the time were actually the experts in designing solutions in partnerships with systems. That was the original, sort of spirit and vision. That theme, around centering those most impacted to really support the design of solutions has been the through line of the work. And we have continued to really expand on that, that spirit, that notion, and that belief into what we're moving in our next 10-year plan.
And Lauren, I know we'll get into this a little bit more as the conversation progresses, but for folks that may not be familiar with some of the particular investments and work that took place, could you give folks a flavor of some of the types of things that TCE invested in and engaged in as part of the kind of core strategies of BHC?
Sure. So when I said, sort of moving the idea of moving investments away from solely services to really, which really, when you look at, we looked at the endowment's sort of first 10 years of its investments, which were really more focused on responsive grant making, discrete responses to need. When you evaluate or ask the question, millions of dollars of investments, the question became, how much have we moved the needle on achieving equity in California? And the sobering answer to that is, we've made some really good grants, but those changes have not been lasting. And so the idea of building healthy communities, let's take a different approach. Let's try something different. And let's move more to root cause and engage community, not just residents, but other stakeholders, to help rethink what health can look like in a community, primarily as defined by those who are most closest to the pain of health inequities, and then build supports that foster deeper collaboration and that support the organizing of those who are most impacted. So I think that initial, when we first, the thinking behind BHC was engaging those who were most impacted, community, and the evolution has been around really supporting organized power of residents to really make demands of systems to shift practices and policies and investments that lead toward more equitable outcomes for all people in their communities and their regions. The investments could be on any targeted system: justice reform, justice reinvestment, healthcare access, land use, housing, anti-displacement. The issue is irrelevant. It's really, what does the community want to focus on in their regions, in their ecosystems, that will get to the equitable changes their families and the families and communities want to see.
Lauren, I think that's very helpful in kind of setting out how TCE got to where it is. And the other thing that I think might be helpful for folks to know, and you started touching upon this, is the importance of taking a very broad definition of what health equity entails. And just before we bring in our next guest, I wanted to give you space, Lauren, to talk about how you and TCE see the relationship between health equity and racial equity.
Sure, Anand, do you want me to answer that right now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So it's very comfortable and easy to talk about health. We all want to see healthy families. We all want to see healthy communities. We all want to see systems that are responsive to the needs of community. And what's really hard to do is to, and we use terminology like social determinants of health. We use terminology like a public health approach to addressing violence. But what's really hard to do is to name what is at the root of that. And what is at the root of that in this country is structural racism. And as someone who worked in the healthcare system for 10 years before coming to the endowment, I can say that this absence of naming what is at the root cause of health inequities is what has prevented us from addressing the robust solutions to get to addressing structural racism, because it exists, it's in the water we breathe, it's in the water we swim in and the air we breathe, but we don't talk about it because we're afraid to lean into it, because it's uncomfortable. For us at the California Endowment, achieving health equity means we have to address structural racism and white supremacy culture. In order to do that, we can't just expect our communities to do that. We have to do it. We have to look at the mirror and understand how we have adopted, how we live and breathe in these racist cultures. And we have to build the emotional fortitude, not just the policy change, to lean in and really break free and ultimately find our full humanity and work to achieve those equitable outcomes that we all want to see realized in America. And so racial justice, health equity, health justice cannot happen without racial justice and healing. The two are inextricably linked.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for setting the table for the conversation so nicely. I want to bring in our next guest. We are very excited to have Jennifer Ito, who's Research Director at the University of Southern California Equity Research Institute. Jennifer, welcome to the LEAP Lab.
Hi, thank you. And yeah, it's just great to be in this space and to be in conversation with Tia and Lauren. You know, even though I actually don't work very closely with either of them, BHC has had such an impact on California that we just feel so connected, and that even just leading up to today's session, it's just been such rich dialogue. So I think we're just gonna get the little tip of the iceberg today, but really just excited for the conversation.
Well, we know you're feeling it in California. We hope folks around the country, wherever they're tuning in, are feeling that impact and feeling welcome into the learning and the work of health equity and more broadly racial equity and racial justice. So Jennifer, we're so happy to have you. I wanted to start with a similar question to you. How did you find your way into the world of BHC? I know you were talking to you as someone that has been an evaluator, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But would love for you to share just what are some of the different roles you've played, and how did you find your way to the work of building healthy communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just being so inspired by Lauren's story, I'll just share a little quick note about my background. You know, I'm 3.5 generation Japanese American. From Sacramento, from the Central Valley, from a family of farmers that came over from Japan and were migrant, followed the crops up and down the state of California. My grandmother was born here, and when World War II broke out, they were forced to take from one day to the next, forced to leave, were displaced from their homes and taken, in my mother's family's case, to Tule Lake, and in my father's case, to Jerome, Arkansas. And so growing up, as a child, and was growing up with my parents worked so often at my grandmother's house for dinner, like every conversation was about before the war and after the war. And through that, my family learned, and my parents in particular learned, that the one thing that no one can ever take away from you is education and knowledge. You can have, from one day to the next, you can have all of your material things taken away, but that is one thing that no one can ever take away. And so they expressed that in me by sending me to the best schools, by sending me to private schools. And they didn't ask for anything in return, except that I do the same for my children. So I had that opportunity, and it is actually, like in some of these elite institutions. And then actually it was funny, I spent some time in Guatemala as well and realized, wow, like people are just inculcated with this notion of the elite, that you are the leaders, you guys are the smartest folks. And there were a lot of messed up people. And realized it was in Guatemala, and because I had come from the US, was just assumed I had sort of expertise. I was straight out of undergrad with no clue, and realized, just opened my eyes a lot around just, US imperialism and destruction of the forest and the indigenous ways of being, that I realized I needed to come back to the US, and actually I needed to come back to the belly of the beast and actually fight for change inside the US. And so that led me to actually do research and provide data and analysis that I do to this day to power social change among those people that don't have access to the best formal education. And I really wanted to dedicate my work to actually bringing up the knowledge and the education for folks to actually participate in political processes, like small p political processes. And so, I did that initially for almost 10 years, for 9 years in South Los Angeles, did research just at a time when Philanthropy, the Ford Foundation, some national organizations were like, hey, there's something happening here, and actually invested in several cities and invested specifically in community organizing. And that allowed that time, it was scope to actually expand and bring on more researchers and more folks internally in-house. And so I was able to get in on the ground floor of actually providing data and research to inform organizing, alliance building, and campaigns. And so it was actually, towards my end of the time there when BHC was launching. So it was a 10-year initiative from 2010, but there was actually like an 18-month process, a pre-planning process, where they were gathering insights and coming to the community, trying to figure out where exactly is the footprint in South LA. Is it this road? Is it that neighborhood? And being asked to attend all these meetings with this idea of the endowment coming with a very cooked plan, learning from past comprehensive change agendas when goals can be fuzzy. They kind of were like, okay, here's our goals, here's our 4 goals, here are our 10 outcomes, here are 5 drivers of change. And, we're going to give you money, which was great that they allowed for a planning process. It was great that they issued some small grants to be part of this, but they wanted us at the table with the police department, with the public health department, with the head of education. And as Lauren said, there's always been a very big emphasis on community engagement from the beginning. So even in the planning process, there was a very strong emphasis that, okay, you guys need to come up with your logic model for 3 years about how you're going to achieve these outcomes. You don't have to work on all of them in the first 3 years, but we do want you to hit all 10 of them by the end of 10 years. And so there was just a lot of friction. Even though we're all in South LA, we don't come with the same theory. There was a lot of distrust. and particularly around resident engagement, because of course there were funds, and of course this was a time of 2008 recession, right? Groups are struggling. Here's some big pot of money. Here's a promise of some big funds coming down for 10 years. Everybody wants to be at the table. And so there was funding to actually engage residents. And there was big friction between service providers saying, yeah, we have a huge clientele. And organizers were like, hey, wait a minute, we're like the organizers. We know how to do this. And so that was kind of just from the beginning, this emphasis on community engagement, and that we've seen kind of over time, actually, there was lots of different words used. It was from community engagement, then it was like, okay, it was resident engagement, then it was resident-led organizing, and then it was community organizing, and then it's become kind of this notion of power building. And I do want to unpack that a bit, because I think there is still a lot of confusion about now that word being equated with civic engagement and all that. So, but we'll get there later. But so we're just as part of, when I switched over to do research full-time through at USC, now called the Equity Research Institute, we actually were brought on to actually help tell the story and figure out what was going on as in the first 3 years from 2010 to 2013, just to catch some early lessons. So that's just a quick how I came to this work.
No, you did a beautiful job of weaving in kind of how you came to the work, as well as some of the early days of BHC. And I think it's really important, because even though this is a hard task to boil down 10 years of work in many communities across the entire state into a short conversation, I do think it is important for folks to know that even though there are some clear lessons and insights we hope others will learn, it's a messy process. It takes time, and it is not a straight shot, down the road from year 1 to year 10. So I think you did very helpful framing. And Jennifer, I'll let you know, it is later. It is now time to unpack power building. So you said we'd get to it later. We're going to do that right now. So I think that is a term that is thrown around, organizing, power building. People use it more frequently now and are more interested in it. How would you define power building? How do you think about power building, and how is it different than some of the other types of ways that community members can be involved that you were talking about?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a whole spectrum, and it's actually out of the work of Selena's. There's a really great spectrum, a really great resource, and we can share this afterwards about thinking about that spectrum of engagement, from like being ignored to getting input all the way to ownership. And so I see power building in a couple different ways. I think one is that because of all the reasons that Lauren talked about, you need to start with the folks that are most impacted, that are either implicitly or explicitly not able to participate in public and private decision-making processes that affect their lives and their communities. So whether that's because they can't vote because of whatever reason, or if it's because they can't attend public hearings because they're in the middle of the day or in a different language. So community organizing is an essential vehicle to actually engaging those folks who just won't turn out if there's just a flyer stuck, or by a message or by a text. I mean, community organizing is essential and because powerlessness is at the very, very root, is one of the key structural determinants of health and outcomes. Like, we have to build power and knowledge and organization to keep our communities healthy. So I think community organizing is central, and any organizer will tell you a resident wants to fight for what change is needed. They don't want to fight for what change is politically feasible. And that's how we'll actually get to change conditions, is if people are telling us our lives are not improving. So that's essential. And yet it's not sufficient to change the condition. In South LA, we always said, we can't change, even if we organized every single resident in South LA, and that was like 250,000 people, we still wouldn't be able to get to the change needed, because that just represents one city council district. Like, we need a majority of city council. We need the state to hear us. We need businesses to hear us. And so So that requires a whole nother set of skills, capacities, strategies in which you need the research, you need the leadership development, you need the communication skills, the policy knowledge and advocacy, and you need strong organizations. And you need what we're learning, and I think what we've really learned, and Lauren spoke to this, is that we're also realizing that there's a lot of harm and trauma in our communities that gets carried across generations, that gets really internalized. And part of this work of power building is to create a different society based on a different set of values, on a different model of how we work with others. And if you don't address kind of the deep traumas at the very individual level, they will replicate those same harmful patterns in the work of organizing. And so we've seen a lot of amazing transformational work that's needed for folks just to realize their own triggers and actually model and see and be part of processes in which they can model a new way in which we can work with communities to build consensus, to actually understand why are we living in these conditions and what are the ways that we can actually change this. That also kind of that work of really addressing trauma and healing, I think is becoming much more recognized as an essential part of the strategy as well.
Jennifer, I wanted to give you space just briefly to say a little bit more about something that I think you're alluding to, which is this idea that there are lots of different organizations, lots of different capacities that are involved in power building. And how have you and your colleagues come to start understanding that landscape and all the different folks involved in any particular region, community, when you're thinking about power building?
Mm-hmm. I mean, we've come to think of this, we actually came out of this work from a movement building lens. But we've actually realized kind of where we're really at when we're thinking about particularly where foundations are funding and in that realm, that it's really kind of an ecosystem of organizations. And so, we have this great little power flower as like a visual, but the main purpose was just to put organizing and base building at the center, and kind of the petals, those supportive roles are all the other capacities, and like I put foundations in the petal, policy advocacy, organizational technical assistance, research, policy advocacy. And they are on the petal if they ascribe to the same values and have the same kind of analysis and approach of realizing at the end of the day, whatever we do, it needs to be growing that center. This all needs to be accountable back to the community. So there are policy advocacy groups, there are government support groups that are in this world, but that we would not necessarily ascribe as being part of the ecosystem, because they just have a different approach in which it's more about the policy, but we see those as being important, but also leading to shallower wins, because when you have a community that's educated, that's ready, that knows what's going on and is in direct relationship with decision makers, they are able to keep kind of the implementation and making sure that win actually translates into improved conditions that they can see every day.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think it's really helpful context to unpack, the idea of power building in this context and providing that kind of framework for thinking about all the different folks and organizations and alliances and groups that are involved in any particular region who's doing this work. I wanted to bring in our third and our final guest for today. Very excited to be joined by Tia Martinez, who is the CEO of Forward Change. Tia has lots of experience, a little bit of research, a little bit of policy. She's been in government, she's been in philanthropy, she's been, creating good trouble all over the place. So we are so excited. Hard to name the role, but not hard at all to welcome her to this conversation. Tia, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to just bring you in to add another layer, another piece of the puzzle to this conversation. And I think there's so much that you can speak to. You've been evaluating and strategizing as part of the Building Healthy Communities work and many other efforts to advance racial justice, racial equity. But really wanted to get your take, Tia, about kind of how funders typically approach these types of policy and advocacy campaigns, and how is BHC different? And I think it's not a hard sell for folks nowadays to say we've got to go beyond programs and services, but there's a difference between policy and power building, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. So would love to hear your reflections on kind of how funders typically approach this, and how did this approach evolve over the course of building healthy communities?
Great, thank you. So I think one way to think about it is just to kind of leap off Jennifer's power flower. Okay, so this idea of a power ecosystem, and in this case, we've centered grassroots-based building groups, but there's the legal shops, the policy shops, the research, all of those folks, all of the kind of usual players, they're all around there attached to and aligned with the center, and that we need all of them to make this shift. Now, this is what happens in the usual course of things, is that funders recognize the limitations of services and programmatic innovation as the only way to do it. They realize that they could put their money in policy shifts, and they could get government money to things and government rule change and get there really faster. So they see power as equaling policy and advocacy, right? And they see they see power as instrumental to their. So they want to end. You want to end childhood obesity. Okay, I need a soda sales tax, and I'm going to find the best professional advocacy shop to do this work, and they're going to kick butt and get this passed. So it's very instrumental, and it's centering one of those petals. Okay, that's who's at the center of this, right? Now, what you do get, foundations are impatient. Like foundations are just, we know that, right? Everybody wants, they want population level change in 3 years, and, here's $1 million and I want you to double, graduation rates and self-rated health, right? So there's an impatience here that those professional advocates can deliver on. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if you would say, if the foundation is holding the strategy and they're like, I really need the soda sales tax, they can go find the really sharp, policy shop to do that work, right? And they get the win in 2 years, okay? And they get to celebrate it. They get to tell their board, look, we got this win, what amazing return, all this money, blah, 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 okay? But what are the limits of that win? Okay, the first, and Jennifer spoke about it. The first thing is, you really want that win to play out in communities of color and in poor communities in real ways. There's going to be no monitoring or implementation on the ground to ensure that these rule changes actually translate into something different. We all know about kind of regulatory capture, right? You can make shifts and change things, and somehow the usual players still make it work for them, right? Without having a constituency pushing, okay? So the issue is the professional advocates, when the foundations come along with the next big thing they want you to do, they're gonna fly over children's health care, or, they're gonna fly away from this. They're not gonna stick with it because, they think it's important on their agenda, but they actually, they don't have a deep personal investment in it the way folks who are living that do. So it's not, I'm not dumping on folks. I am one of them. First of all, I will own my pedal residency. I am, a professional advocate, right? And we have a broader agenda, and we like, yes, soda tax. We also need this and that, right? So there's not there's not support for implementation, but there's also not a sustainable strategy, because you haven't created a base. The example I always use is, why do middle class people have great schools? Why do middle and upper class people have great public schools, right? They have great public schools because they have motivated, resourced families that show up and hold folks accountable and demand, right? And are listened to, right? So that when we have these top-down policy expert changes, you are building that constituency among our folks that we need. And by the way, we're going to need kind of twice the power, because we're going to be facing structural racism, explicit racism when we try to talk to that school board, right? So I think that's the kind of usual way, right? So now we want to talk about how that could look different and how BHC did it different, right? BHC was one of the amazing things about TCE is its learning loops. It could drive, I've been a consultant forever, and it can drive us crazy because they're always changing their outcomes and their approach, and there's a new framework, and I'm like, Jesus, just stick with one thing, right? But what they're doing is learning. What they're doing is making mistakes, listening to everyone get really upset, and then making changes. And then people are still upset and they make more changes. So so BHC did not come into this knowing this, but where they arrived after this pivot to power that Jennifer was talking about, where they arrived is, hey, you know what? Instead of centering the petals and getting those, let's go to the center. Okay, let's begin to support those base building groups that build power in a sustainable way in communities close to the ground. And they can work with those petals. They need those petals, but we're going to center these groups. Now, easier said than done, because you just have to recognize that the environment we're in, the historical period we're in is, nearly 50 years of massive disinvestment from voluntary membership groups that organize folks on the ground. Okay, so that means if you're going to invest in grassroots, you need to, first of all, put in the money, right? And then you need to be patient, okay? Because the hard work of rebuilding that infrastructure, but also the hard work of base building, of involving folks, members of the community in this, of building their leadership skills, of building their ability to speak, and of hassling with all the pedal partners like myself who, you have to negotiate. Listen, remember, we should be leading this, not you, right? So that's a lot of work. And so really, this is patient capital. Okay, you're not going to get your 3-year win. You could shortcut it and you could get your win much faster. But if you want the longer, sustainable, powerful one, then you're willing to fund that center. Now, just one last thing, and then I know I'm taking up too much time. I can tell by your eyes. But the last thing is the kind of the historical background which this functions against is, Theda Skocpol writes about the decline of voluntary membership organizations in the United States from the mid-60s to the 70s, right? So it used to be the way that ordinary people kind of exercised power was through big membership organizations that had local affiliates. They were like unions, the Lions Club, there was churches and their networks. Not only did they have people, actually members, doing things like being the secretary, being the chair, figuring out the visits, they had their members actually doing things, and they were connected in regional and national networks that allowed them to exercise power. With the 60s came a pivot, the 60s and the 70s, we moved away from membership to professional advocacy. Okay, so now we have membership groups. The membership group is going to be like the ACLU, right? Or the environmental defense. It's membership in name only. You get an email letter, you give money, right? That's how you do it, but you're not actively doing this. You're not involved. So it's a different type. And what you do is you cede your power, instead of ordinary people figuring this out, you cede it to professionals like myself. And so I've benefited greatly from this shift because everyone wants lawyers, right? So now remember, foundations have been behind this building up of this. So who's been centered over the last 50 years increasingly are the petals, right? So that at the other side, membership groups have been hollowed out by COINTELPRO, by backlash. So all of the membership groups we have either withered and died, or they've been hollowed out through counterinsurgency, right? So now what that means is now where we are is we're in rebuild, okay? And so what my urgent plea to everyone is, if you want to affect health, right, in real ways, address race and power, and be willing to invest over the long term. Now I'm done.
No apologies necessary, Tia. I apologize we don't have more time for everyone to share, but I think just, again, another brilliant perspective to add to Jennifer and Lawrence. I want to stay on this theme that you ended on, Tia, which is looking to the future. There's a lot more work to be done. And as you think about philanthropy, would love to hear from you, Tia, and then bring Lauren and Jennifer in before we close out the panel on this question of what will it take? What will it take to be more serious about building power, sharing power with communities, and truly advancing equity and racial justice. So would love to hear, Tia, any kind of thoughts you have, because I know we've had a conversation before about the level of investment that currently exists, and would love for you to kind of carry that thought. What will it take to truly build and share power and have philanthropy make more meaningful progress toward racial justice?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm going to put it kind of in a health justice frame, since a lot of folks here. One thing that's really exciting is the number of conversion foundations from the South that are here. Okay, this is a huge opportunity. You know how little of the philanthropic pie the South gets anyway. Okay, but what I want to talk about is the kind of two things that are needed. First, a real understanding of what power is, what Jennifer talked about, and getting away from this idea of resident engagement, right? It's about people coming to meetings, or we're holding focus groups, or, get beyond that, even get beyond, okay, now we believe that, you should have folks that organize community members and have them give informed input and can actually get beyond that to where you're really supporting organizations to do long-term leadership building, and you're letting those organizations set the agenda, as opposed to setting the agenda for them, creating the table. So that's the first thing, is to understand that loop and understand the power ecosystem. The second thing is just money, okay? So this is an analysis of really, really great piece was released earlier this week or last week from the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, looking at the surge of money that went in from philanthropy around racial justice in the wake of George Floyd. It takes a long view. It looks at sort of 10 years of data. And this is the reality, right? So about in 2018, which is the year they have the most recent data, total giving from foundations was about 92 billion, okay? So 92 billion. And of that 92 billion, about 5.8 billion went into racial equity. And the bulk of this was going to things like charter schools and after school programs, right? So this wasn't a racial, so first of all, remember that. So what they did is they said, okay, well, let's look at how much of that is going to racial equity or racial justice and grassroots. So an annual number. What they found is that in 2018, just 75 million, that's it. Out of that 95 billion, just 75 million went into grassroots organizing for racial equity, okay? TCE probably accounted for at least half of that, right? Before this pivot, right? Exactly. And so this is profound. Like any TCE, as TCE increases the amount that they give to base building, these numbers are going to jump in big ways. But for any of you all, any increase in support of this is going to be incredibly meaningful, because you're beginning at such low levels. But if we seriously want to rebuild that infrastructure and get enough power to challenge who we're up against, then it's going to take concerted, deeper investment over time, and it's going to take way more than TCE.
Thank you, Tia. I want to get others in the conversation. So Lauren, please.
Oh, thanks, Ann. And I was going to say one more thing to Tia's point. I'm glad she brought up the report, which I included in the chat. What of the 7% total, 1% went to racial equity efforts, and then 6% went to racial justice efforts. The two are very distinct. Racial equity is the idea of moving monies around in existing systems to increase services, or, to increase access to services in an existing system. Racial justice is about transformation, which requires organized power rooted in a racial equity, racial justice analysis led by those most impacted. That's about transforming systems. And so that's 1%. That's the 1% that Tia is talking about. So in many ways, we feel like we've done a lot. It feels like, wow, we've come so far. We haven't. We have not. We should not feel like this is, we should be glad that we're moving the needle, but it is so woefully inadequate, given how much money there is out there that could be going to these kinds of deeper structural investments.
Really appreciate that, Lauren, and being very clear about the distinction between racial equity and racial justice. Jennifer, would love to get you in on the conversation, just reflecting on Tia and Lauren's comments and this overall question of, what will it take on the part of philanthropy to make more progress toward racial equity and, as Lauren put it, racial justice?
I just want to build on this notion of, being in a learning community about what it takes, for social change. And one of the ways that I think one thing is just realizing not one size fits all, and that to really understand and to be in conversation with others that are kind of have the same vision and long-term horizon, to really understand the context in which the work happens. So, whether it's you're considering a certain particular place, it's understanding that context matters. So that's taking into account the socioeconomic conditions, the demographics, the politics, the geography, the history of a place really shapes the nature of this work, as does the capacities for change. So what does that ecosystem look like? How robust is it? How broad? How what's their reach? How connected are they? What's kind of the breadth and depth of leadership in that whole ecosystem? And to tie it back to the points that Lauren and Tia raised, like what is the resource base? And so I think that's particularly understanding, we have lots to learn about how community organizing and movement building works. Would love to see kind of philanthropy build its own, groups like TCE and others to really work together in alliances to think about what are the strategies to grow that resource base, to invest back into community organizing and power building.
So before we close out, I want to give each of our panelists a chance to just share a parting thought that they would give to folks who are viewing. We'll start in reverse order, and I would love, Tia, just any closing thought or advice you give to folks who, again, we're just scratching the iceberg here of these topics and the learnings from BHC, but would love to hear kind of your final thought or reflection on the conversation, Tia.
Besides, like, we need more money to the center of the flower, right? I think that if you want to, in a big, sustainable way, change health outcomes, you must confront race, and you must center the folks who are experienced this, and you must build their power. So that's the equation. And I could tell a million examples about how we went from technical approaches that really had little impact, like in the criminal justice field, to once you brought those technical approaches together with the community and community power, and by the way, the community will insist that you bring up race, even if it doesn't poll well, you then begin to see transformative shifts. And actually, if you wait long enough, you see massive change in population level indicators. That's my.
Thanks, Tia. Jennifer, closing thought?
I think to, expand beyond policy, as you're saying, like to really think about the full terrain in which change needs to happen, and all the full arenas, that it's policy change, but it's also administrative change, it's shifting narrative, it's shifting our culture, it's shifting kind of the way corporations and businesses work. So I think it's just understanding the full terrain, and in that sense, you open up the field and create more opportunities for real strategic conversations about what each of our roles is in moving towards health and justice for all.
Thank you. And Lauren, we'll give you the last word.
Okay. So I'm wondering how this is all landing on you, like how you're feeling about this. Like, I can imagine it's swirling in your bodies, in your mind, about like how you're gonna bring this back. And I guess to your colleagues and to the organization, and what I would first say to you all is that's a good thing. And just to remember that if we want to see transformation in the systems, in communities, we have to be ready and willing to do our own transformation internally. So if the urge is to want to go and do the fund right now, resist that urge and do some work on interrogating your own cultures that will allow you to set the groundwork for doing your own transformation. That would be my first word of advice. And that is not only something that requires thinking, which is what white dominant culture tells us we have to do. It's about the feeling. It's about the embodied practice you need, because this is not easy work. This is hard work. You're going to have board members pushing back on you. You're going to have people deflecting, resisting, denying, getting defensive. And so you have to get yourself prepared and others prepared in a way that allows you to do that deeper level of interrogation. And that's what our communities want us to do. Look in the mirror. We need to look in the mirror and be the change we want to see on the external.